You are listening to the Navigating Adult ADHD podcast, where it's all about education, support, and coaching for adults with ADHD. I'm your host, Zena, a late diagnosed ADHDer, here to help you unpack the challenges, frustrations, and the positive side of living with ADHD. With my no BS approach, I'll help you to better understand your unique ADHD brain and how you can work with it to feel better, increase your self-confidence, improve your relationships, and ultimately achieve your goals. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Navigating Adult ADHD. Today we're going to talk about dopamine hangover, which I'm very excited to talk about with you guys. So if you listened to last week's episode, you would have heard that I was on a holiday recently, and I'm going to talk about that again because it's very relevant to today's episode. So I went to Rarotonga in the Cook Islands, and I was away for 7 nights, had an apartment that was beachfront. We actually had hammocks hanging between palm trees in our tropical garden. It was pretty cool. Funny story about hammocks, because when I was in Costa Rica on a solo travel trip years ago, 2018, I spent 6 months traveling through South and Central America solo. And I was in Costa Rica and I stayed at this Airbnb, and there was a hammock out on the deck, and it was like overlooking rainforest and stuff. And I was like, oh, that's a magical idea. But it was a fabric hammock, and I went to the fabric hammock and I went to like unroll it, and I was like, cool, I'm going to lie in it. And as I started to unravel this hammock, there was this giant spider in it. I was like, fuck no. So I let the hammock go, and it just wound itself back up. Then I refused to sit out on that deck because I was like, okay, if there's one in there, they're probably everywhere. And back in New Zealand, we don't have many big spiders. I was like, I'm all good with spiders. But then you see this giant one overseas and you're like, maybe I'm not that good with them. So yeah, I got sidetracked with that little hammock story. So anyway, we're on this tropical island, my partner and I. And we've got this beautiful apartment that we're staying in. We're literally looking at the ocean, listening to the sound of the waves, waking up to that every day. We can snorkel right off our beach. It's beautiful coral with brightly colored fishes. It's like Finding Nemo, right off our own private beach. And then we can walk to cafes and restaurants. We were able to walk along the beach and go up to different resorts and have cocktails and things. And it was pretty magical, to be fair. I had a great time, and I talked to you guys all in the last episode about how I was actually able to switch off and enjoy myself. So during that trip, I got a lot of dopamine. So, the sun was shining, I was doing lots of new things, new food, trying cocktails, able just to do whatever I wanted throughout the day and not having to do normal things like laundry and washing and well, that's the same thing, isn't it? Laundry and washing. But laundry and having to, make decisions and work. I didn't have to go to work, all of those things. So I was just flooded with good feelings, lots of good feelings. Dopamine. And what happened was I got on the plane to come home, and like many of us can relate to, I started to feel pretty down, right? And so many people have, said to me before, of course, the trip's over. It makes sense that you've got to go back to work and you feel low, right? And I've always been yeah, of course, it makes total sense. But I didn't understand why in our brains, which is what we're talking about today. So I got back home and we flew in quite late, and we flew into Auckland Airport, and we're about a 3-hour drive from there. I live in Papamoa. And so we drove home that night. We got home about 11 o'clock at night, and I was super stoked to see my cats. Just made me very excited and happy. But then reality kind of started to sink in. We're home now, and it's cold, and it's winter here, and I've got to start back at work on Monday, and I've got so much laundry to do, and it's just back to normal life, and it's quite boring and, dreary, and you can tell by the tone of my voice, not exciting, right? I was experiencing a dopamine hangover. Okay. So dopamine, I'm just going to go back a little bit and just explain some of this stuff. Dopamine is a chemical in our brains that motivates us to get out of bed each morning, It's what, drives us to go and overcome our fear of public speaking and what gets us off the couch to walk over to the fridge and get ourselves a drink, right? Dopamine is a chemical in our brains that motivates us to do things, right? So it's responsible for drive and motivation and feelings of satisfaction. So basically, dopamine feels pretty good. Now, those of us with ADHD, we have less dopamine than neurotypical people without ADHD, all right? So every day when we wake up with less motivation, less satisfaction, less drive than people without ADHD. Now, that may be why some of us choose to take medication or why a lot of people self-medicate, sometimes without even realizing. So it's why we catch ourselves scrolling on our phone at 3 p.m. watching cat videos, or why we might be in the kitchen, tearing it apart looking for the last chocolate biscuit. And it's why other people go for a run. It's all to do with dopamine. We're all seeking dopamine to fill our tanks and feel good. So while I was on holiday, while I was on this tropical island, I was getting a lot of dopamine. I was getting sunshine and warmth. I was eating out. I was trying new foods and different restaurants. I wasn't having to cook. I was trying different cocktails. I was snorkeling right off the beach and seeing all these colorful fishes. I went on hikes and I got to explore new places. There were so many new experiences. So what was happening was my tank was getting loads and loads of dopamine each day, way more than I would normally be getting. But at the same time, I also wasn't spending my dopamine like I would usually. So when I'm spending dopamine, that looks like having to focus or concentrate at work, having to make decisions. What am I going to wear? What am I going to eat? What time am I going to leave to go to that appointment? I also didn't have to get up at 6 a.m. every day. And I didn't have to make dinner or do washing and all these things. So I was spending way less dopamine. So what had happened is I had spiked my dopamine levels. Now, back in episodes 12 and 13 of this podcast, I talked about dopamine in detail. And I talked about how to understand and master your dopamine. It was like a mini masterclass, okay, across those 2 episodes. Now, one of the key things that I shared is that we each have a baseline level of dopamine. That's really important, okay? So if you were to imagine a gas tank, and every day you wake up and it's half full, unless you've got ADHD. So when we wake up, our tank is only a quarter full each day. And that is our baseline level of dopamine, okay? Now, certain activities that you engage in throughout the day are going to add to your tank. And other things that you do are going to drain your tank. Okay, so we'll take my friend Greg, for example. He loves to run. And while it's going to cost him some dopamine to go for a run, he's also going to get some back in return. So here's how I like to think of it. If Greg going for a run costs him 2 coins of dopamine, but in the process of going for a run, he produces 4 coins of dopamine, right? He's made profit there of 2 coins of dopamine. It's therefore a very worthwhile investment, okay? So again, people with ADHD, we wake up with less dopamine each day than people without ADHD. So our baseline level of dopamine in the tank is lower than theirs. Okay, I love to picture it like a fuel tank, and ours is a quarter full and theirs is half full. Now, of course, that's a made up number, but having the visual I think is so helpful. And again, things that we do throughout the day, like when I go to work and have to make decisions and speak to people and take action, that's using dopamine. But again, other things that we do, like me cuddling my cat or going for a walk, those produce dopamine. Okay, so that levels in the tank fluctuate throughout the day. Now, of course, when I was on holiday, I wasn't really spending a lot, but I was getting a lot. So I spiked my baseline level of dopamine pretty high and had it up pretty high for a whole week, meaning I felt pretty great for a whole week. So Here are two things that we need to know where our dopamine levels are concerned. Okay? Number one, what goes up comes down. And number two, dopamine is never, ever satisfied. So, starting from the top with what goes up comes down. So, studies show that the bigger we spike our dopamine levels, the greater the fall. And when that dopamine level comes down, okay, so after it's spiked and when it falls, it actually plunges below baseline. So what that means is where we would usually have, say, a quarter of a tank, that would be our standard baseline amount that we would wake up to each day, we plunge below that, okay? Meaning we're going to have less dopamine, less motivation, less drive, less energy, less satisfaction, right? So we're going to feel a little bit worse than we would regularly feel. So that's really important to know. What goes up comes down, and it comes down below where it started. I call this a dopamine hangover. So when I got home from my holiday after being on this dopamine high for like a whole week, what did I experience? A dopamine hangover. I woke up the Friday morning. We drove back late Thursday night. I woke up Friday morning and I was just like lethargic, I think is the best way to put it. I had less energy mentally and physically. I was very reluctant to go to work, even though I love my work and I love my clients, all of that. I was just reluctant to have to go back to work. My mood was low. I was just like irritable and annoyed at everything. I just wanted to be back on that tropical island. Okay? This is the dopamine hangover. Now, the second thing that is so important that we need to know where dopamine is concerned is that dopamine is never, ever satisfied. Okay? If dopamine was to have a slogan, a motto, it would be more. Okay? Dopamine is never, ever satisfied. So this is why gamblers keep gambling even when they continue to lose money. It's why alcoholics keep drinking even when it is, negatively impacting their health or their relationships. And it's why I usually book the next holiday on the flight home from the last one. Because dopamine is always looking for the next high. And it's really important to acknowledge that sometimes that comes at a cost. So, have you ever noticed how you've achieved something big? Perhaps you've ticked an item off your bucket list, only to find yourself feeling kind of low afterwards, or perhaps really surprised that it didn't provide you with this, ongoing sense of joy or accomplishment or satisfaction that you were expecting from achieving it. Maybe you've been on a holiday and you felt the post-holiday blues, right? Maybe you've done a triathlon and you thought, you're going to feel amazing afterwards, but on the drive home, you start to feel pretty lousy. That, my friends, is a dopamine hangover. So you could experience this after you achieve a goal, right? As I was just saying, this was me. I did a triathlon a few years back. It was my first and only one. And I remember I'd trained so hard and I was excited but nervous at the same time. And it felt like such a big deal to finally do a triathlon. And I did it, and then I crossed the finish line and there were friends and I was taking selfies and it was such an amazing energy. And then I went out to lunch with a friend and we were celebrating, and then I started driving home. And by the time I got home, I remember sitting on my couch and being like, is that it? Like why don't I feel better? I thought I'd feel pretty awesome for doing this. Now what? Okay, so again, you might experience a dopamine hangover after you achieve a goal, after you perhaps tick something off your bucket list. Again, it could be after you do something that you enjoy. It could be a night out with friends, or you've gone to a concert that you've been looking forward to, or after you've gone away for a weekend. Then you could experience this dopamine hangover. Also, it can happen after doing something that was outside of your comfort zone. So this happens to me anytime I give a talk on stage. Okay, like that still gets me kind of outside of my comfort zone. I feel all of the feels, and then I feel super proud and accomplished and glad I did it afterwards, and it, spikes the dopamine. It could be, after you speak up at work and you've been thinking about it for ages and finally you've done it and you're really glad that you did it. It could be trying something new in front of other people. Okay? All of those things can spike your dopamine levels. And once they're finished, right? Once you've, got back from that night out with your friends or the concert's been and gone, once the dust settles, it can leave you experiencing a few hours or days of the dopamine hangover. So you will notice you could have less energy, you will have perhaps a lower mood, less drive or want to do the things that you would usually do, and also less interest in things that you would usually enjoy. So the purpose of understanding and identifying a dopamine hangover is not to eliminate them altogether. I don't know about you, but I'm going to keep traveling. I'm going to keep going on holidays. I'm going to keep, doing scary and hard things, leaving my comfort zone. So the purpose is not to, eliminate it, but it is to understand and identify it, to be aware of it and know what's happening so that we can give ourselves compassion and grace for the few hours or the days that we are experiencing it, so that we can know that nothing has actually gone wrong. This is part of having experienced so much dopamine. This is actually normal. Okay? Now, by also having this awareness and knowing that you could be experiencing dopamine hangovers in your life, it gives you the opportunity to see where you might be experiencing them quite frequently, where you might be having more frequent drops in dopamine levels from engaging in regular behaviors that are not supportive of your mental, emotional, and physical well-being. So I'll give you an example. I used to drink regularly, and it was more of a binge drinking of alcohol. And I used it to try and feel good or to numb the anxiety I was experiencing and try and shut all the thoughts of my head down, to try and quieten it all, okay? And what started as like just one drink after work, it soon became 2 drinks after work, and then it progressed to 2.5 and then 3 drinks. And sometimes I was finishing a whole bottle. And this was per night, okay? And of course, the dopamine was never satisfied. It wanted more, more in order to try and get that same high. And not only did I start to experience the physical hangover, okay, drinking too much alcohol, we all know what that's like, but I also struggled with the low dopamine. And so what that looked like is it led me to avoid working on my personal goals because I just didn't feel like it. I was feeling kind of lethargic. I didn't have as much motivation. I beat myself up because, I'd done it again. I said I wasn't going to drink, and I said I was going to go for a run this morning. I said I was going to do this, and I didn't do it. I was often telling myself I've just got no discipline. I've got no self-control. But then I would always justify it again that night with, I deserve to have a drink, or I deserve to feel good. I've earned it. Dopamine feels good. But it's really important for us to understand not all dopamine sources are created equal, just like food. Okay? Drinking alcohol every night was not healthy for me. Not in those quantities, for sure. Just like eating donuts every single night for dinner wouldn't be healthy either. But doing it once in a while, a very different story. So my friend, when was the last time you experienced a dopamine hangover? All right, huge love to you. Take care. I'll speak to you soon. If you are loving what you're learning here on the podcast, but you still feel like your ADHD is holding you back, I can help. Using evidence-based coaching tools and my own experiences, I'll help you to manage your emotions and feel better, to increase your productivity, grow your self-confidence, and create the life that you were meant for. Visit zenajones.com/thrive and schedule an ADHD support session to get started.